Hello and a very warm welcome to episode 26 of the Green Bean podcast. I reckon that's about where we are. I hope you're doing okay. A very special welcome to you if this is your first visit with us, and welcome back if you've been here before. My name's Katie Green, and this is Jack, and we're really glad that you're here. This is a podcast where I share my various creative projects. I am an illustrator by trade sometimes, but I also knit and design knitting patterns, sew and design fabrics, which is new and exciting in this episode. And I embroider and spin, and I just love to dabble in loads of creative things. So this podcast is a space where I get to share what I've been working on and what's been inspiring me, and lots of nature and outdoors on Dartmoor, which is where we live in South Devon in England. So in this episode, I've got a bit of drawing to share with you, some knitting, some sewing and some embroidery. But more excitingly, before we dive into the main episode, you might have spotted the exciting shirt that I'm wearing. I'm really delighted to share that I've got some of my illustrations printed on fabric for the very first time, and I am so excited. For the longest time, ever since I started sewing my own clothes, I really have wanted to put my illustrations on fabric and make them available for people to buy. And I've spoken before about websites like Spoonflower, which are okay, but I've never been happy with the quality of the printing, particularly the way that it washes. So I've been searching for a year or so to find a supplier that is a bit more local and that has the quality of printing and fabric that I'm looking for. I'm very happy to say that I found them. And in my shop, I've just launched two very special fabrics. The first of which is the one that I'm wearing. It's a plain cotton lawn with my sheep printed on it in grey. And I also have a cotton and linen blend fabric with the sheep printed in black, which I had more in mind for bags, cushions and more structured projects, whereas the lawn is kind of soft and floaty and more suitable for garments. So I'm going to chat more about the fabric in the sewing section later on in the podcast. But before we dive in, I just wanted to share my excitement about my new sheep shirt with you. So settle in with your cup of tea or coffee, whatever you're drinking, whatever project you're working on, and I hope you enjoy this episode. have a new little drawing project that I'm starting today, and it's something that I'm doing just for fun. Last weekend I spent a weekend away in Somerset with my dear friend Will, and it was the first time that I'd really done any socialising at all since the coronavirus lockdown. And it was an extremely emotional time for me. It was really special, both to be able to leave my village and my county, but to be able to see a friend who I haven't seen for, about 9 months. It was a really lovely weekend. So when I came home, I was feeling a little bit overwhelmed and emotional about it. And I really wanted to capture some of the joy of that lovely time that we spent together, because the weather was beautiful. We did some lovely walks in the countryside. It was just a really nice kind of peaceful weekend away to finish off my holiday time. So I really wanted to have a go at capturing that in a comic. And as you can see, I've done a storyboard. So we're looking at 6 square pages with several panels on them, like I'd say 6 to 8 panels on each page. So it's quite a detailed little comic. And I'm planning to do it just in black and white in pencil. And I've got my watercolour paper out, even though I'm not going to use inks. I like the texture of the watercolour paper when I work on it with pencil. So this is what I'm going to use. And I'm going to set up the page so that I get 2 of the square pages on each sheet. So altogether it will take 6 sheets of this watercolour paper to make the comic. And I've got a blank sheet to begin with. So the first thing I have to do is get the pages laid out and spread out these panels. Now it's worth saying that when I do a storyboard like this, it's very, very rough. It's usually just an idea of getting the pace of the story that I'm trying to tell. If there are words, then figuring out where those words are going to fit. You need to make sure that if you need to include speech bubbles, there's enough space for whatever needs to be said in those speech bubbles. In this case, I've decided to make the comic silent, so there will be some speech bubbles that show expression, but there's not going to be any words. I want it to be a wordless piece. One of the things I really like about doing wordless comics is it slows the reader down, because there's no way of reading it without looking at the images. Quite often when comics are very text heavy, I find myself reading the words and not spending as much time looking at the pictures. And obviously you see the pictures because you're scanning past them, but I really like it when a comic has a passage of silence and it forces me to slow down. And that's very much what the weekend away was about, was a space out of my normal routine and a chance to slow down. So silence in the comic seems the best way to capture that. But nonetheless, I think I probably will change the layout a bit from my storyboard. That's usually what happens. I have a rough idea and then I start laying out on the page and then kind of get a better idea of how things fit together. So there's still evolution in this process. It's not set in stone yet, but I'm ready to make a start anyway. So I've now got my first page set up with very rough outlines of the shapes of the panels, and you can probably see that I've changed it quite a lot from this first sketch where all the panels were square shaped, and I've included this big circular panel in the middle. And the reason I've done that is a couple of things. First of all, I just like changing and playing with the shapes and seeing what that does to the narrative. But in this particular comic, the theme of the circle and the idea of being in a bubble outside of like the normal routine of life and things is going to become a visual theme. So I wanted it to be there right from the first page, and it's going to repeat throughout. So that means I'm going to be editing the layout of these future pages as well. But for now, I'm just going to get started on this one. As I've mentioned before, when I'm working with soft pencil, I have to start from the top left of the image and work down so that I'm not smudging anything that I've already done with my hand while I'm working. So I really do have to begin with the first panel. There's no avoiding anything that is awkward or difficult to draw. I've just got to get right in the deep end and get started with it. So that's what I'm going to do. Although I've had many projects on my sewing table lately, there isn't one that is more important or more exciting than the shirt that I'm currently wearing. And I took some video of the making of it to share with you, but really the most exciting part of it is that it's made in fabric with my own illustrations. Like I said at the top of the episode, this is just like the icing on the cake of my dreams for my online shop, is to be able to put my own drawings on fabric and make my own clothes with my own drawings on them. And I feel a little bit like the possibilities are endless. And obviously they're not, because there are restrictions to how much space I have in the shop and how much stock I can afford to invest in at the moment. But I am hoping that I'm going to be able to expand the fabric range to include a few more designs in the near or near-ish future. That's my hope. But I'm trying not to get carried away and overexcited, and also remember that I've got this amazing sheep fabric and there are more things that I plan to make with it. But I knew as soon as I saw the sample of this lovely kind of crisp but also soft cotton lawn that I wanted to make a shirt. And I made the shirt that I've been making over and over lately. Turns out I've got 4 of them in my wardrobe now, and I'm not really sure how that happened. But it's the Hedwige shirt by Republique de Chiffon. I first made it with dinosaurs on, I think, last year, or certainly early this year. And I now have a version with beetles and a version in Liberty Lawn fabric, and this sheep version, which I'm really pleased with. So the adaptations I made to the pattern was I narrowed the shoulders ever so slightly. I have quite narrow shoulders, so I just took them in ever so slightly. I was really happy with the fit of the armhole, which is unusual. I quite often find that sewing patterns don't give me enough depth in the armhole. So what I've done now is, because I like the fit of this armhole, I draft this armhole onto other projects that need armholes where there's usually about an inch difference. So that's been really useful to find a sewing pattern whose armhole fit I do really like. It's because I'm swiping it and using it on lots of different projects. Let's see, the other edit I made to the pattern was to just curve the collar. So I don't mind a pointy collar, but I think particularly on a white shirt it could look a little bit formal, or maybe like I was a waitress. So I wanted to curve the collar and make it look like a little bit more playful and cute. And that's really it. I followed the pattern pretty much to the letter for the rest of it. I used these little grey buttons, which I got from Textile Garden. I've missed seeing them. I often shop for buttons from Textile Garden at the UK kind of yarn and craft shows. They're very frequently at the same shows that I go to. And it's been a shame not to see them in person, but it's great to browse from them online. I end up always ordering like 2 or 3 buttons to choose from, but it's always useful to have buttons in stash ready for various projects. So I feel like it's never a waste of money to spend on a few extra buttons, because they'll always come in useful for something. These ones are actually made from recycled cotton, which is really nice, and they just were the perfect colour grey, so I was really, really delighted when they came in the post. Now my plans for the other sheep fabric, the linen and cotton blend, I initially purchased it with bags in mind, and I do plan to make a project bag out of it, but I also feel like, I don't know, I need to try making a garment with it as well, and I haven't had a chance to think about what pattern I'm going to use yet, but I'm pretty sure that I'm going to need to make a pair of sheepy dungarees. I just imagine turning up to wool shows, craft shows, when those can happen again. Obviously they're not happening this year due to coronavirus, but when we can go out and be in the world again, to have a pair of joyful sheepy dungarees to wear would just be fantastic. So that's what I'm planning to make with the other fabric. So yeah, it's just really exciting. Now, you may or may not know that the shop currently lives in my kitchen, so we have a huge rack that's holding these rolls of fabric in the kitchen, and it's so fun to be able to roll them off and cut them for people. It feels like having a real shop. And I know that sounds a bit silly because I've had a real shop for as long as I've had a shop. But I don't know, I think because my first job was working in a haberdashery and craft shop, there's something about cutting fabric for people that's reminiscent of that and feels like I'm really doing this, which is really exciting. So huge thanks to everybody who has ordered the sheep fabric already. I'm really excited to see what you're planning to make with it. And yeah, I'm hoping that it's going to be a staple addition to my shop, with new designs to come in the future. The knitting project that has been getting the most attention lately is the same one that I showed you in the last episode. That's my Caledonia jumper by Sylvia Watts-Cherry, and I am still really enjoying it, although taking it nice and slowly because it's been summery and hot here. I've not been feeling like I want to pick up my knitting very much. But when I do, this has been the project I've been reaching for, and you can see that I am getting along pretty well. This is still the first piece, the back of the jumper, but I've just reached the underarm and I'm now starting to shape the armholes. So it should start flying off the needles at this point. I usually find that once you've started to decrease those stitches for the top of the piece, that it tends to move along pretty quickly. So it's nice to feel like I've hit a point where I've made some progress and I'll be able to start the second piece. And also perhaps block this jumper, because as lovely as these cables are looking, I really like how this yarn is showing them off. They're just going to really pop after they've had a good block, so I'm looking forward to doing that. Now my plan with this jumper is, after I finish this back piece, is to knit a sleeve, because sleeves are always my least favourite part of a garment to knit, whether I'm knitting them flat or in the round. I am often annoyed by how long they take. I think you forget that because you see a sleeve as a smaller piece compared to your body, but actually in terms of area of fabric, to create a sleeve is not that much less yarn than to create a body piece. So they take just as long. I always feel like they shouldn't. So I'm going to tackle the first sleeve after I finish this back piece and before I do the front of the body, so that once I've got the whole body finished, I will only have one sleeve left to do. I feel like I waffled, but I hope that made sense. Just mixing it up so that it feels like more variety rather than having to knit two pieces of the same at the end of the project. Now, if you didn't catch me talking about this project in the last episode, the yarn I'm using is a Gotland and Blueface Leicester blend from Nellie Eve, dyed with nettles, and it's this beautiful kind of grey, silver, green colour, which is going to fit perfectly into my wardrobe and go with everything. In fact, I really like how it goes with my sheep shirt. And it's a different, it's a DK weight yarn, and the pattern is written for a worsted yarn. Worsted thickness, not worsted spun. And that means that my gauge is not quite right. So I'm knitting a size up from the size that I would have chosen. I figured out the percentages, and that's the size that I needed to make. But it does mean that my row gauge is also slightly different. And when it comes to the depth of the armhole and also shaping the cap of the sleeve, I'm going to need to take a bit of care to make sure that I get the correct size and not end up with something that's shallower because my row gauge is smaller. So I'm going to have a little bit of attention to pay when it gets to that point. But luckily so far I've just been able to follow the pattern as it's written for a slightly larger size. Now, it's been a long while since I've shared any progress on my big embroidery and quilt project about British birds, and that's partially because I haven't been working on it that much. It's a super slow project. I haven't got any deadline in mind, just enjoying really taking my time with the embroidery and the hand stitching. But I have made a little bit of progress, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to check in and show you. Because I've also had some changes of plans and thoughts about how I'm going to assemble it. Now, I've never made a quilt before. Let's be quite clear about that before we go any further. But my dear friend Molly Johansson of Wild Olive makes a lot of quilts, and she has, when she came to visit England, maybe, I think it might have been her first visit, which was probably now about 10 years ago. She taught me the principle of English paper piecing, which seems wrong as an American to teach me that, but nonetheless, I'd never heard of the concept. I'd always thought that quilts were assembled on the machine. But something about the English paper piecing process really appealed to me. And I've recently been listening to the Mel Gedrich is Quilting podcast, which if you haven't come across it, I really recommend. It's an audio podcast with Mel of Mel and Sue fame, one of the former presenters of the Great British Bake Off, and a friend of hers called Andy. And they are approaching an English paper piecing quilt for the very first time. And I don't know, something about listening to them chatting along as they do it really made me think, oh, this is something I want to do. And revisit my bird project, which I had planned to machine sew, and just felt like actually I want to sew this by hand. So here I am, attaching my very first finished bird to an English paper piecing template. And I said that as though I know what I'm doing. I don't really, but I'm doing it, and seeing it come together, it's actually quite convincing. So the first bird that I finished is the one that you saw on the podcast a while ago. It's a golden plover, and it's embroidered and appliqued with felt onto a scrap piece of tweed. And the shape that I've decided to use for my birds is a 4-inch square, and I've just cut a little off each corner to result in an octagon. And I'm going to connect those with 1-inch squares of green tweed, because basically my collection of tweed scraps, which I got both from buying a packet of Remnants and from my sewing leftovers, didn't have enough green in it. I know, shocking. So I wanted to make sure I had a way of introducing enough green into the quilt. So I thought if I use the green for those in-between diamonds, and that might mean just purchasing 1/2 metre of green tweed specifically for that purpose, then at least the quilt will have enough green in it overall, because that's very important. I can't have a quilt that doesn't have green in it. And it will kind of tie all the things together. A lot of the rest of it is going to be browns, because that's the colour of most British birds, let's be honest. And kind of autumnal colours. So I really like the idea of there being a bit of green in there as well. So that's my plan. And as I say, this is the very first piece that I've finished, which here it is. And I don't know what do you do when you get to the end here? Just a couple of double stitches and cut it off? Seems about right. And that will hold the shape of my octagon until I'm ready to stitch the pieces together. But for now, I'm just going to be collecting these pieces and carrying on sewing my birds. So the next bird that I've started is a skylark. You can see that I've got the main colour of the beige felt on here, and I've been stitching into it with white and brown, and I now have a little bit of darker brown stitching to add. Skylarks are birds that we see a lot on Dartmoor, and particularly over the last few months they've been nesting and they've been singing, and they what they do is they nest on the ground. So in order to protect their nest, when you're walking close to them, the adults actually fly up into the sky, and they have this really kind of trilling song. I think they're trying to distract you from stealing their young, which obviously is not something we're interested in doing because we're not predators of skylarks, but that's what they do to try and distract you from their little ones. So this is the second bird that I've been working on. For this episode's mending section, I've pulled out this pair of socks. They are the Naname socks by Yucca. I knitted them last year with RiverKnits BFL 4-ply, and the rainbow is made from the rainbow of yarns that I dyed myself in the mini skein dyeing workshop. It feels like a different time when I was able to travel to Northamptonshire and take that workshop with RiverKnits, but it was in fact just December last year. And I love these socks. So they're just, I didn't follow the complete pattern. The pattern has quite a unique construction. I think it casts on at the heel and has you work up to the cuff and down to the toe. But I knitted them cuff down with a heel flap and gusset, which I find is what fits my foot the best. And then I followed the pattern's instructions for these diagonal stripes, which are created using short rows, and then finished off with a barn toe. As I say, I love the socks, but because it's a pure BFL yarn with no nylon, they weren't as tough as some of my other socks. And I've got a little peeking hole in one of the toes. This is always where my socks wear through, and as I think I've said before, I ask a lot of my socks. I walk for at least 2 hours every day. So my socks take a lot of hard wear, so it's not surprising that they go through in the toes. So I'm going to darn them. The other one is fine, but you can see actually there's a little bit of dye wearing off the yarn there at the toe. So this one is definitely going to break through at the toe at some point as well. But it's safe for the time being. I'm just going to darn this one. So I've got my darning mushroom at the ready, and I just couldn't lay my hands on the exact yarn that I used. I'm sure it's in a cupboard somewhere, but I haven't been keeping up to date with where I've been tucking my yarns. I usually keep a pretty organised record of where I store things, but I haven't got that. I don't know where it is. So I pulled out a scrap of yarn that I had lying on my desk from another pair of socks I darned recently actually, and this is the Exmoor Sock yarn by John Arbon. This one does actually have a bit of nylon in it, so it's nice and tough. Okay, the colour's not the same. This is green, the sock is blue. I don't really mind too much with having a bit of visible mending. I think it's fine. So I'm just using what I had lying around, and I'm going to get this sock back into action. As happens from time to time, I've ended up reading a couple of slightly disappointing books lately, such that I'm not that excited to share them with you. So instead, I've picked something slightly different, which is a new purchase. And it's this book called Interesting Insects, published by the Natural History Museum in London. And I picked it because the Natural History Museum is really one of my favourite places to visit when I go to London. It's tricky to pick a time to visit where it's quiet enough to enjoy, because it can get extremely busy, especially in the summer. But ever since I was a kid, I really loved going there, and it is part of what sparked my fascination with biology and the natural world. And I'm going through a phase of enjoying insects a little bit at the moment. So when I spotted this book, I decided it would be great to add it to my collection. And I really like it because visually it is just stunning. So it includes double-page spread, detailed photographs of specimens in the museum. The photography in this book is beautiful. I'm not super in love with the descriptions. Some of them are better than others. They give you some really interesting facts about the insects. They tell you obviously where they're from, their genus and species, and their size, so you can imagine the scale of them. But mostly, I'll be honest, this is a book I bought to look at the pictures, and I really, really recommend it for that. There's just so much inspiration if you enjoy looking at colour, shape, texture, patterns. I mean, if you want to get into designing knitting patterns, there's loads of inspiration in here. It's a great addition to my shelf, and I'm really pleased that I grabbed a copy of it. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Green Bean podcast. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about what we've been up to and sharing some creative time with me. If you've enjoyed the podcast, I hope you might consider supporting it over on Patreon. I offer patrons an extra episode in between every episode that's published for free here on YouTube, as well as vlogs and discounts in my online shop. If that's not your thing, no worries. You can also find me on Instagram as @KatieGreenbean. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care and thank you so much for watching. Bye.